In the heart of suburban America, where the houses stood in neat rows and families seemed to blend into a picture of comfort and stability, Grace Bennett believed she had built the kind of life most women dreamed of. To neighbors and friends, she and her husband Daniel were the couple people pointed to as an example of success. The reliable pair who showed up for school events, hosted summer barbecues, and posed for Christmas cards that exuded warmth. They were the family everyone thought had it all together. A steady marriage, two healthy children, now off in college, and a home that carried the echoes of laughter, birthdays, and milestones that had spanned decades. For Grace, the bond she shared with Daniel was built on trust. She had met him in her early 20s, charmed by his easy confidence and the way he seemed to make life feel certain in an uncertain world. Over the years, she had stood beside him through job changes, tight finances, and the chaotic years of raising kids. She was the anchor to his ambition, the caretaker of the home they built together. She had woven her identity into the life they shared, never doubting that they were walking the same path side by side. And yet there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when Grace felt a shift in the ground beneath her. Daniel's excuses for working late grew more frequent. His phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now guarded like a state secret. Small details began to gnaw at her. The faint smell of unfamiliar cologne clinging to his shirt, receipts for dinners at restaurants she'd never visited, the way his eyes sometimes drifted past her as though his mind was fixed elsewhere. At first, she brushed it aside. Every marriage had its rough patches, she told herself. After decades together, routine could dull the spark. Perhaps he was simply distracted, stressed about work, or adjusting to the quiet house now that the kids were gone. Grace was not the type to leap to suspicion. She had invested too many years into believing in Daniel to suddenly doubt him now. She silenced the whispers in her mind, convincing herself that her unease was little more than the echo of an overactive imagination. But deep down, in the quiet hours of the night, Grace felt the stirrings of something darker, a warning she couldn't name. She would lie awake, listening to the rhythm of Daniel's breathing beside her, wondering who he truly was when he wasn't in their home. It was a disorienting thought, one she tried to chase away. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and once it took root, it grew steadily. Her days became haunted by small inconsistencies. A shirt she didn't remember washing, folded neatly in his drawer. A vague mention of a client dinner that didn't appear on his calendar. A weekend trip for work that seemed oddly timed, coinciding with anniversaries or birthdays he once would have insisted they celebrate together. Each moment could have been explained away in isolation, but stacked together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. Grace tried to confront the feeling with reason. She reminded herself of the man she had built her life around, the father who had tucked their children into bed, the husband who had once held her hand through the storms of life. To doubt him felt like doubting her own history, her own choices. And yet her intuition screamed louder with each passing week, urging her to look closer, to stop accepting easy answers. One particular evening crystallized her unease into something she could not shake. Daniel had told her he would be working late, handling some last-minute reports that needed to be submitted by morning. Grace didn't think much of it until she noticed his briefcase left behind in the study, a detail Daniel, who was meticulous about his work, would never overlook. She stood there, staring at the leather bag resting against the desk, her heart racing. Something inside her whispered that the truth she'd avoided for so long was beginning to surface, and that the life she thought she knew might not be hers at all. She forced herself back into routine, preparing dinner for one, cleaning the dishes, moving through the motions of a household that felt increasingly hollow. But when Daniel finally came home hours later, smiling that easy smile she once adored, Grace felt a chill instead of comfort. His embrace seemed rehearsed, his kiss absent-minded. She studied his face, searching for the man she thought she knew, but saw only shadows of someone slipping further and further away. The doubt wrapped around her like a fog, thick and suffocating. Grace still wanted to believe, wanted to cling to the image of the faithful husband, the loyal partner. But trust, once fractured, does not heal easily. And as she watched him move through their home that night, acting as though nothing were amiss. She realized something had shifted irrevocably. Her world was no longer steady. It was tilting, quietly, dangerously, toward a truth she had not yet uncovered. And Grace Bennett, though terrified, knew she could not remain blind forever. The days following that evening weighed heavily on Grace, every detail in her home now feeling like a clue in a puzzle she hadn't asked to solve. Daniel's absences had always been woven into the fabric of their marriage, the late nights at work, the weekend conferences, but now each explanation sounded thinner, more rehearsed. She found herself becoming hyper-aware of the little things. A voicemail he dismissed before she could hear it, a faint lipstick smudge on his collar, so faint she almost convinced herself it was an illusion. The scent of soap that wasn't theirs lingering on his skin. She wanted to believe her eyes were lying, that her heart was inventing betrayals that weren't real. Yet her instincts told her otherwise. One afternoon, while tidying up the study, Grace stumbled across a receipt wedged between pages of a book Daniel had left open on the desk. It was for a family-style restaurant on the opposite side of town. The date froze her in place. The receipt was from the night of their wedding anniversary, the very evening he had claimed to be swamped at the office. Grace remembered that night vividly. She had waited for hours setting the table with their best dishes, only for Daniel to arrive home exhausted, apologetic, claiming deadlines had kept him away. Now holding the receipt in her trembling hand, she saw the truth in cruel simplicity. He had been somewhere else, with someone else. The world tilted. The house she had filled with trust and warmth suddenly felt foreign. The memories she had cherished seemed to flicker like fragile glass under the weight of doubt. Grace sat in silence, clutching the paper, the ticking of the clock on the wall pounding in her ears. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe it had been a work dinner. Maybe colleagues had joined him. But the details of the receipt told a different story. 2 meals, a bottle of wine, and a dessert for sharing. Grace's heart clenched as a darker thought clawed its way to the surface. Was there someone else who had celebrated her anniversary with her husband? That night, as Daniel slipped into bed beside her, Grace lay stiff and sleepless. She could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, as if he had nothing to hide, no weight pressing on his conscience. But her own mind raced. She replayed the moments she had trusted without question, the phone calls he stepped outside to take, the weekends he claimed were consumed by business travel. They no longer seemed random. They formed a pattern, a life lived beyond her reach. And for the first time, Grace admitted to herself that she no longer knew who Daniel truly was. Suspicion had now grown into determination. Grace knew she couldn't ignore the signs any longer. If Daniel was lying, if the man she had trusted for decades had carved out a secret life, she needed to uncover it. She needed truth, no matter how painful. Her investigation began quietly, almost timidly. She checked his phone when he left it unattended, but he had set a new password she didn't know. She peeked into his briefcase but found nothing out of the ordinary. Each dead end only sharpened her resolve. Grace began keeping a notebook, jotting down the times he left the house, the excuses he offered, the stories that didn't align. She started noticing the gaps between his words and his actions. It was on a Saturday afternoon, when Daniel claimed he was meeting an old client for golf, that Grace decided she could no longer sit idly by. She followed him. Her heart pounded with each turn of the wheel as she trailed his car through the familiar streets of their town, her palms slick against the steering wheel. She expected to see him at the country club, maybe even at the office, proving her fears unfounded. But instead, Daniel drove 20 minutes across town, into a neighborhood Grace had never visited before. The homes there were smaller, more modest but tidy, lived in. She parked her car a block away, pulse hammering in her ears, and watched as Daniel pulled into the driveway of a pale blue house with white shutters. He got out, carrying groceries. What happened next made Grace's breath catch in her throat. The door opened and a woman appeared. Younger than Grace by a few years, smiling as if she had been waiting for him, and behind her 2 children rushed forward, squealing with delight, calling out, "Daddy!" Grace felt her knees weaken, her vision blur. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as the scene unfolded before her. Daniel hugged the children, kissed the woman on the cheek, and carried the bags inside as though he belonged there. As though this had been his life all along. Her chest tightened with a pain unlike anything she had ever known. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't a fleeting betrayal. This was an entire second life, a family that existed in the same town, living parallel to hers. Grace sat frozen in her car, watching as the man she thought she knew became a stranger before her eyes. Every memory they had built together now felt counterfeit, hollowed out by the realization that he had been dividing his love, his time, his very identity. The truth was worse than she could have imagined. She wasn't just sharing her husband with another woman. She had unknowingly shared him with an entire second family. In that moment, Grace understood that her life had changed forever. The world she thought she knew was gone. What lay ahead was a reckoning she could not yet name, but one she knew she could not escape. The drive home that night felt endless, each red light stretching into eternity as Grace clutched the steering wheel with trembling hands. Her body moved on autopilot, but her mind was a storm of disbelief and dread. She had seen it with her own eyes. Daniel smiling in another doorway. Daniel cradling children who weren't hers. Daniel slipping seamlessly into a world she had never been allowed to glimpse. The betrayal gnawed at her like acid. Every image replayed in her mind. The woman's familiar ease with him, the children's innocent laughter, the way he carried those groceries as though he had done it countless times before. Grace could not silence the thought that she had been replaced, not just as a wife, but as a cornerstone of his life. When she reached home, she sank into the silence of her living room, the walls closing in on her. The photos on the mantel, vacations, birthdays, graduations, now seemed like props in a cruel play. She wondered if Daniel had ever looked at those same pictures and felt the shame of his double life. Or had he grown so skilled at compartmentalizing that he saw no contradiction at all? Over the following days, Grace's instincts sharpened. She began watching her husband with new eyes, his lies suddenly transparent. She noticed how his excuses were delivered too smoothly, how his absences always coincided with weekends and holidays. When she pressed him gently, asking if work was keeping him too busy, his smile was quick but shallow, his reassurance hollow. She needed more than suspicion. She needed proof. Grace began taking quiet steps. She followed him again, always careful to remain unseen, memorizing the patterns of his visits. Each time she watched him step through that pale blue doorway, her heart cracked further. Sometimes he arrived with groceries, sometimes with toys, sometimes with nothing more than his presence. But always, he was welcomed home. On one occasion, she parked closer, heart hammering as she dared to sit within sight of the house. Through the curtains, she glimpsed him seated at a kitchen table, a little girl perched on his lap, coloring in a book as he guided her hand. Grace's breath caught, her chest aching with a grief she had no words for. The questions multiplied. Who was this woman? How long had this family existed in the shadows of her own? Did their children bear his name, or had he cloaked their identities in secrecy the same way he had cloaked his double life? Grace's curiosity warred with her devastation. She needed answers, but each discovery threatened to shatter what little strength she still clung to. Back in her own home, she kept her silence. She cooked dinner, smiled at neighbors, and even laughed politely at Daniel's stories. But beneath her calm exterior, she was unraveling. At night, when he reached for her, she lay stiff, her body betraying the truth her lips could not yet speak. He was a stranger in her bed, a man whose lies had seeped into every corner of her life. And yet, with every lie, Grace's resolve hardened. She would not confront him empty-handed. She would not allow him to twist the truth, to gaslight her into believing she had imagined it all. She needed evidence so damning, so undeniable, that Daniel could never escape it. What had begun as doubt was transforming into something else entirely, the quiet fury of a woman betrayed, sharpening into determination. Grace would uncover the full truth, no matter how painful. And when she did, she would make sure Daniel faced it head-on. The final straw came in the form of a simple accident, or perhaps, to Grace, it felt like fate. One afternoon, while sorting laundry, she found a crumpled envelope tucked into the pocket of Daniel's jacket. Inside was a school newsletter, complete with photos of smiling children lined up on bleachers. Her eyes scanned the page, heart racing, until it stopped on a face that made her stomach drop. A boy, maybe 10 years old, with Daniel's unmistakable blue eyes and crooked smile. The resemblance was undeniable. The boy was his. Grace sank to the floor, clutching the paper as though it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Tears blurred her vision, her chest heaving with sobs that refused to be silenced. She had feared it, suspected it, but to see it in print, to see his features mirrored in another child, was a wound so deep it nearly broke her. When Daniel came home that evening, she forced herself into silence, folding the newsletter back into the jacket as though nothing had been disturbed. She watched him closely as he greeted her, his voice warm, his eyes carrying that same deceitful charm. It was almost unbearable to see how easily he played the role of husband, while another family called him father. But Grace no longer felt paralyzed by grief. Instead, something inside her shifted. The devastation that had once consumed her hardened into clarity. She could no longer live suspended between doubt and denial. The truth was undeniable, and so was her need to confront it. She began gathering every scrap of evidence she could find. Photos taken discreetly from her car, receipts, the newsletter with that boy's face staring back at her. She built her own case in silence, a private archive of betrayal. With each piece, her resolve grew. In quiet moments, she rehearsed the confrontation in her mind. Would she scream? Would she weep? Would she throw the evidence onto the table and demand the truth? Each scenario played out differently, but always ended the same way. Daniel exposed, his lies stripped bare. At night, as he lay beside her in peaceful slumber, she stared into the darkness, her mind alive with rage and anticipation. For years she had given him everything, her loyalty, her trust, her love. And he had repaid her with deceit so elaborate it had stolen decades of her life. Grace knew the time was coming. The mask he wore could not last forever. The breaking point had arrived, and she would be ready. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that usually comforted Grace after a long day. But tonight, silence felt like a weight pressing against her chest. She sat at the dining table, her evidence spread before her. Photographs tucked neatly into an envelope, the crumpled school newsletter, receipts for dinners he had lied about. Each piece told a story Daniel had tried so carefully to bury. When she heard the front door open, her pulse quickened. Daniel stepped in, humming softly as he hung his jacket by the door. He looked the part of a devoted husband. Tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. But Grace saw him now for what he was, a man split in two, carrying lies like second skin. "Long day?" she asked evenly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Always," he sighed, kissing her cheek lightly before heading toward the kitchen. "Deadlines are eating me alive." The lie rolled off his tongue so effortlessly that for a fleeting second she marveled at how skilled he had become. But tonight, she was done playing along. "Daniel," she called, her tone sharp enough to make him pause. Mid-step, he turned, brows knitting in faint confusion. "What is it?" Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid the envelope across the table, her eyes never leaving his. "Open it." He hesitated, sensing the shift in the air. Slowly, he pulled out the contents one by one. The photos of him walking into the blue house, the receipt from the restaurant, the school newsletter with the boy's smiling face staring back at him like a ghost of truth. For the first time in years, Grace saw the mask slip. His face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a man grasping for words that wouldn't come. "Grace, I can explain." "Don't," she cut in, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with fury. "Don't you dare insult me with explanations. I watched you. I saw the house, the children." Her breath hitched, but she pushed through, her eyes burning. "I saw everything." Daniel dropped into the chair opposite her, his hands covering his face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, voice muffled. "I never wanted you to find out this way." Grace let out a bitter laugh, the sound foreign in her own ears. "This way? You mean the truth? How many ways did you imagine I'd discover that my husband of 25 years has a second family across town? How many lies were you prepared to tell before I finally stumbled onto the life you've been hiding?" He looked up then, eyes bloodshot, desperation etched across his face. Grace, I love you. I love our life. That, he gestured weakly toward the evidence. It just happened. It doesn't change what we have. The word sliced through her, sharp and cruel. It doesn't change what we have, she repeated, her voice rising. You have 2 children calling you daddy, a woman welcoming you home. Do you think our marriage survives that? Do you think I survive that? Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't flinch from his gaze. She wanted him to see her pain, to feel the weight of the destruction he had caused. Daniel reached across the table, but she pulled her hands back, folding them tightly in her lap. Grace, please. I was trying to balance both. I didn't want to lose you. I thought I could, His voice trailed off, shame silencing him. The rage inside her flared hot. Balance both? I'm not a ledger, Daniel. I'm not a part of your double life you can manage like a schedule. I gave you my youth, my trust, my everything, and you repaid me by carving out a life where I don't exist. He bowed his head, defeated. The man who had always seemed so confident, so sure of himself, now sat small and crumbling before her. For a flicker of a moment, she almost pitied him, but then she remembered the little girl's arms around his neck, the boy's laughter, the woman's smile at the door. That pity turned to ash. Grace stood slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You've taken everything from me, my marriage, my sense of safety, my belief in us. Her voice softened, though her words cut deeper for it. But I will not let you take my dignity. Daniel looked up at her then, searching for some trace of the woman who had once loved him, without condition. But what he found instead was a woman transformed by betrayal. Her grief hardened into steel, her pain alchemized into resolve. I want you out, she said finally, her tone steady as stone. This house, this life, you don't get to live it anymore. You made your choice when you walked through that other door. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged rhythm of his breathing. Then slowly Daniel nodded. I'll pack a bag, he whispered, his voice hollow. Grace didn't respond. She stood there silent as he pushed back from the table and walked down the hallway. The same hallway he had walked countless times before, but tonight carrying the weight of a truth that could never be undone. When the bedroom door clicked shut, Grace let out a long, shuddering breath. Her body trembled, her tears flowing freely now that she was alone. But beneath the grief, beneath the devastation, there was something else too. A spark, the first glimmer of strength, rising from the ashes of a life she thought she knew. The night after Daniel left, Grace sat alone at the dining table. The evidence still spread out before her like relics of a life she no longer recognized. The silence of the house pressed against her, heavier than ever. She had confronted him, stripped away the lies, and pushed him out of the home they had built together. But the betrayal still burned inside her like a wound that refused to close. She knew the truth now, but the weight of it wasn't hers alone to carry. For decades, she had lived as Daniel's faithful wife, their lives intertwined with family friends, church gatherings, neighborhood barbecues. They had been admired, envied even, for their supposed stability. Grace had played her part, smiling in holiday photos, welcoming neighbors through the door, standing beside Daniel as if nothing could shake them. And now she could not stomach the thought of everyone still believing the lie. The decision came to her quietly, almost instinctively. The world needed to see Daniel for who he truly was. He had built his reputation on deception, and Grace would not allow that mask to remain intact. If he had humiliated her in the shadows, then she would drag his secrets into the light. It began with the church. Their congregation had always seen them as pillars of the community, a couple to admire. That Sunday, Grace dressed with deliberate care, her back straight, her chin lifted, though her heart was heavy. As she walked through the doors, whispers followed her. People noticed Daniel's absence but said nothing, waiting for her to offer an explanation. She gave them more than they expected. When the service ended and the congregation lingered in the fellowship hall, Grace stood before them. She tapped her glass with a spoon, the clear chime cutting through the chatter, until every eye was fixed on her. For a moment she felt her voice catch in her throat, but then she remembered the pale blue house, the children calling Daddy, the boy's smile in the newsletter. The fire inside her steadied her resolve. "I want to thank all of you," she began, her voice calm but firm, "for the love and friendship you've shown me and my family over the years. Many of you have called us an example of a strong marriage, a model for others. But tonight, I need to set the record straight." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, confusion etched on their faces. Grace held up the envelope of evidence, her hand steady. "For months I have lived in the shadow of a lie. My husband, Daniel, the man many of you have praised, has not been the husband you thought he was. While I was building a home with him, he was building another one across town, with another woman, with children." Gasps filled the hall, the weight of her words sinking in like stones dropped into water. Grace saw the shock in their eyes, the disbelief, the shifting glances. She pressed on. "I confronted him with the truth, and he admitted it. Years of deceit, years of dividing his life between us, while I stood here believing in a marriage that never truly existed." Her voice wavered, but she did not falter. "I tell you this not to seek pity, but because I refuse to let his lies define me. If you knew us, if you thought you knew me, then you deserve to know the truth." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace felt every heartbeat in the room, the sting of whispers beginning to swirl. She could see the pity in some eyes, the outrage in others. But she also saw something else: admiration, respect, the recognition of her courage to speak out. In the days that followed, the truth spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered in hushed voices at the grocery store. Friends who once called Daniel a role model now avoided his name altogether. His reputation, carefully constructed over decades, began to unravel thread by thread. The other family could no longer remain hidden either. Their existence became a subject of speculation, the pale blue house no longer just another anonymous home across town. Daniel tried to contain it. He called her, begged her to stop, argued that she was destroying not just him, but the children who bore his name. But Grace had no patience for his pleas. "You destroyed them yourself," she told him coldly. "I'm simply telling the truth." For the first time in years, she felt a strange, unfamiliar power. It wasn't the life she had wanted, nor the battle she had chosen, but it was hers now. The control Daniel had stolen from her, through lies, through manipulation, was slipping from his grasp and returning to hers. Grace didn't revel in the humiliation she had unleashed. It wasn't revenge she sought, but justice. The kind that comes when truth is no longer shackled by silence. She knew her life would never be the same, but at least it was real now. And that, for her, was enough. As she stood at her kitchen window one quiet evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, she felt the embers of resolve still glowing inside her. The battle was not over. Legal fights, financial battles, and painful reckonings still lay ahead. But Daniel's lies were no longer safe, and Grace Bennett, once the trusting wife, was now the woman who had torn the mask from his face for all to see. The fallout came swiftly, like cracks spidering across glass until the whole pane shattered. Once Grace spoke the truth aloud, it could not be contained. The community that had once admired Daniel now eyed him with suspicion, their whispers turning sharp, their support dissolving like smoke. Friends who had shared dinners at their table stopped calling. Colleagues at his firm began asking quiet questions. And Grace, who had once felt trapped in silence, now found strength in each word she spoke. But exposure was only the beginning. Grace knew that secrets as large as Daniel's did not exist without consequences, reaching far beyond reputation. There were bills to pay, bank accounts to examine, and decades of financial trust she could no longer take for granted. One morning, with trembling hands but a steady heart, she walked into the office of a lawyer who had known her family for years. "I want to see everything," she told him. "Every account, every asset, every lie." The lawyer leaned forward, listening as Grace unfolded her story piece by painful piece. The hidden family, the receipts, the photographs, the school newsletter with the boy's familiar smile. He didn't interrupt, only nodded gravely as she laid out the evidence. When she was done, he adjusted his glasses and said, "Grace, this isn't just betrayal. This is fraud. If he's been supporting another household with your joint resources, the law will see it for what it is. Grace left that office with a new fire in her chest. It wasn't vengeance she carried. It was resolve. Daniel had taken so much already. He would not take her financial security, her children's inheritance, or the dignity she still clung to. When she confronted Daniel with the lawyer's findings, his carefully rehearsed calm began to fracture. She met him in a sterile office, the divorce papers laid neatly between them. His jaw clenched, his hands restless against the table. "You don't have to do this," he muttered, his voice low. "We can work something out privately." Grace's gaze was cold, unwavering. "You worked everything out privately when you built a second family behind my back. This isn't negotiation, Daniel. This is accountability." His shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. For a moment, Grace almost pitied him again. The man who had once stood so tall now reduced to a shadow of himself. But then she remembered the years of deception, the nights spent alone, the boy's eyes staring at her from that newsletter. And her pity hardened back into steel. The legal process was grueling. Bank statements revealed transfers she had never authorized, accounts she had never known existed. Every line of numbers told another story of betrayal. Dinners, gifts, even school tuition paid out of funds she had thought were theirs alone. Each discovery cut deep, but also fortified her determination. Neighbors she once greeted with polite smiles now approached her differently. Some offered condolences, others admiration. More than once, a woman squeezed her hand and whispered, "You're braver than I could ever be." Grace didn't feel brave, not in the quiet moments when grief washed over her like a tide. But she accepted their words, letting them settle into the cracks of her fractured spirit. Meanwhile, Daniel's carefully balanced life crumbled. His firm, worried about the scandal, began distancing themselves from him. The other woman, the mother of his second family, could no longer hide in the shadows, her name whispered in grocery aisles and church pews alike. The children, innocent and undeserving of the storm, became symbols of his duplicity. The man who had once juggled two worlds with apparent ease was now being crushed beneath the weight of both. For Grace, the process was not without pain. Nights were long, haunted by memories she wished she could burn away. Sometimes she stood in the doorway of her children's empty rooms, wondering how she would ever explain the depth of their father's betrayal. But each morning she rose, put on her shoes, and carried herself into another day of reckoning. And slowly, she began to feel something shift. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was freedom. The silence that had once felt suffocating now carried the faint echo of possibility. She no longer shared her home with lies. She no longer built her life on illusions. Grace Bennett had faced the storm head-on, and though it left her scarred, she remained standing, stronger, clearer, unyielding. Daniel's world was collapsing, but hers was only beginning to rebuild. Months later, the house no longer felt like a prison of memories. Grace had rearranged furniture, painted walls, and cleared away anything that carried Daniel's shadow. What once was a stage for lies had become a space for her own renewal. She had survived the legal battles, endured the whispers, and watched as Daniel's carefully constructed image crumbled. Yet what lingered wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. The betrayal had scarred her, yes, but it had also stripped away illusions, leaving her with something stronger than before, herself. Grace began exploring the life she had once put on hold. She traveled with friends, picked up painting again, and spent mornings sipping coffee by the window, not waiting for anyone to come home. The silence, once suffocating, was now hers, peaceful, steady, honest. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the neighborhood, Grace caught her reflection in the glass. She didn't see a woman broken by betrayal. She saw a survivor, a woman who had faced the darkest of truths and still stood tall. Daniel had tried to live two lives, but Grace at last was free to live one, fully, authentically, and entirely her own.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.